Hi, everyone. This lecture is going to cover the second half of the 20th century, post-war, World War II to postmodern. It corresponds with Chapter 21 in Understanding Art, the 11th edition. The learning objectives for this chapter are to be able to explain the major features of post-war art forms, including abstract expressionism, assemblage, figurative art, pop art, photorealism, minimalism, performance art, conceptual art, new image painting, and neo-expressionism. There's a lot. Discuss important examples of art dealing with issues of gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. Trace the development of architecture from modernism through postmodernism and deconstructivism, and summarize major themes of the art of the 20th century in India, Pakistan, China, and Japan. And this chapter starts with a quote that says, "Being an artist now means to question the nature of art." And that's by Joseph Kosuth, who we will see some work by him later on. Here's a timeline for where we are. We're starting at the end of World War II and going through 1980 / we'll look at some contemporary artists who are kind of doing some of the same work that was started maybe in the early 80s, 1980s, things like that. So we will have some official styles / movements, similarly to the way that we've been talking all semester, but also we're just going to get into some artwork that is more kind of dealing with the same kind of themes and are not necessarily all a collective official group, like maybe the Surrealists were an official group. So I'll point that out as we go along. We're going to start with the New York School and the style of abstract expressionism. This style emerged in New York in the mid-20th century, so around the end of World War II. The art of abstract expressionism emphasized spontaneity, gestural brushstrokes, non-objective imagery, and fields of intense color. Some abstract expressionists focused on gestural painting methods, and we're going to call that color or action painting, and while others explored subtle interactions of color, and that's going to be color field painting. So we'll look at it, both examples. And we're going to start with Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock is originally from Wyoming, and he came to New York to study with Thomas Hart Benton, who was actually one of the well-known regionalist artists. And so it's important to remember that Pollock's style that we know him for with action painting was not where he started. That was the journey of a progression of styles. So when some of his earlier work is representational, you can recognize things in it, and then started moving more abstract stuff that looked like he was inspired by Picasso and some of the surrealists. And he started doing these drip paintings in the 1940s and 50s, and they were paintings that he took the canvas, instead of painting on an easel in front of him, you can see in this picture, he laid the canvas down on the floor. And so he would move around and drip the paint. He used just regular old enamel, like house paint. So he even used kind of commercially purchased paints instead of traditional oil paint, which is what we think of maybe as the classic canvas painting medium. So he would walk around, and so essentially the idea is that he's just kind of doing these like drips and splatters of paint that are controlled by his unconscious. And the term action painting was coined by an art critic, Harold Rosenberg, to describe Jackson Pollock's process. So here we have Jackson Pollock's painting 1. He often did not give them very descriptive titles. And when he was doing these drip paintings at this time period, he was also involved with psychoanalysis. And we've mentioned that with some of the previous styles like surrealism. And Jackson Pollock believed very strongly in the role of his unconscious mind, the accident and spontaneity how important those were in the creation of his art. He was influenced by the Automist Surrealist. Remember, that was just the automatic writing where you just sit down and kind of write whatever comes to your mind. And what does that mean about what's going on in your mind underneath that conscious layer of your brain? And then so he was very much interested in trying to tap into his unconscious brain and have that be part of what was coming to the surface for his artistic expression. And we'll leave Jackson Pollock with a quote from Clement Greenberg, who is another art critic at this time. He said, "Pollock's talent is volcanic. It has fire. It is unpredictable. It is undisciplined. It spills itself out in a mineral prodigality not yet crystallized. It is lavish, explosive, untidy. What we need is more young men who paint from inner compulsion without an ear to what the critic or spectator may feel. Painters who will risk spoiling a canvas to say something in their own way. Pollock is one." And there is actually a great film about Jackson Pollock where Ed Harris plays Pollock. And I think it's a great kind of retelling of the artist's life at this time period when he was very well known for these paintings. And now we're going to talk about Jackson Pollock's wife, Lee Krasner. Lee Krasner was one of the few abstract expressionist action painters who were females. Most of them were, it was a male-dominated style. And Lee Krasner had wanted to be a painter from the time she was young. She went to some of the best art schools. She was influenced by artists like Picasso and Mondrian and the Surrealists, and certainly abstract expressionists like her husband, Jackson Pollock. And she was getting a lot of exposure to some of those European artists who came to New York in the 1930s and 40s. And both Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner were experimenting in the mid 1940s. Krasner's work tended to be smaller in scale and seemed to have it's a little bit more controlled than Jackson Pollock's work, and maybe a little bit more conscious application of the paint. And her art career did get put on hold. She very much understood that part of her role was to help support her husband. So there was a period of time when they were married that she was not working quite as much as her husband was. And then after Jackson Pollock's death, Lee Krasner started to paint more. Her style became much freer and her canvases larger. And she really had kind of a rebirth in her artistic career after Jackson Pollock's accident. He was killed in an automobile crash. And the painting that we're looking at, Easter Lilies, was painted the year that Jackson Pollock died. And you have these jagged shapes and bold black lines up against some of these colors. So, we're seeing maybe some remnants from some of the dark outlines that we've seen in some earlier styles. And then there is a little bit more control in terms of her putting the paint on the canvas. It's definitely not quite as, kind of spontaneous and seemingly random like Jackson Pollock's, but it is definitely, you can kind of still see some of that gestural work. And that is one of the big characteristics of action painting, is you can kind of see how the artist has applied the paint on there. And here are two paintings by Willem de Kooning, who is from Holland originally and immigrated to the United States in 1926. And he also was a member of the Abstract Expressionists. And you can see that his work retains somewhat of a representational, element to it, whereas Jackson Pollock's work and Lee Krasner's work is completely non-objective. They are not painting objects. that are supposed to be recognizable, whereas Willem de Kooning is very much on that very abstract end of things, but you can still see some of the shapes in there and what they're supposed to be. He did a lot of figures and portraits, and then he really moved into this like very strong abstract style with these very harsh, jagged lines, and a lot of them were paintings of women. There's been a lot of writing about maybe this has to do with maybe his personal issues with women. So a lot of times the women are painted very abstractly, somewhat unattractively, I guess you could say. Like they're not flattering portraits of women necessarily. Sometimes they seem to have kind of like these just kind of like masked faces on them. And you have, maybe just like indications of their bodies in space, but we see some of that influence from Cubism, where you just kind of see this disillusion, like there's no necessary distinction between the figure and the background, that kind of deconstruction between the object and the background space. So you have kind of that pushing and pulling against that picture plane. And de Kooning is one of the few abstract expressionists who never completely gave up figurative painting, meaning you could always kind of see some shapes in his works that looked like things we recognized. And also, his wife was also an artist as well, but she's not in this chapter. So look up Elaine de Kooning. There's a somewhat famous painting of the leading figures in the New York School of Abstract Expressionism. There were 28 artists, and mostly all of them were men. There was only one woman artist in that photograph, Hedda Stern, and her work was considered much less aggressive in character than the rest of the men's paintings. And this artist, Joan Mitchell, she was also an abstract expressionist who worked in a really gestural style, but she also was not in the photograph. But she is considered one of the leading artists of abstract expressionism. And you can see, once again, that sense of urgency as maybe a mood of turbulence as the paint is being applied to the canvas. The colors, there's kind of a raw energy to it. It's one of those things that, you don't necessarily have to particularly like it, but you can definitely kind of imagine the artist applying the canvas to the paint, and that's part of the idea, is to see like this was an event. And that's something that was often spoke about with the action painters, is that it becomes the evidence of some kind of event that happened. For some abstract expressionists, the action painting seemed devoid of emotional content. And so they focused on these large canvases with just these large fields of color, hence why this is called color field painting, that had color that seemed to vibrate or pulsate on the eyes. The idea is it kind of envelops the viewer and provides a unique sensory experience. Mark Rothko is one of the leaders of color field painting. He started off doing some more kind of surrealist style painting, and then he started moving towards these large, floating, hazy edged, big fields of color on his canvas. And that's what he is mostly known for, are these really large canvases that have these just floating rectangles of color. And there's sometimes just very subtle differences in the tones. And these are all about kind of absorbing you in the color. And let me just pause for a moment and tell you that Mark Rothko is one of my absolute favorite artists. And I remember seeing his work in one of my early art history classes in college and thinking like, what am I looking at? It's just some squares. And I'll just let you know right now, you will never fully appreciate Mark Rothko's work unless you see it in real life. If you see one of his paintings in person, you might still not particularly love him, but it's a completely different experience. So I would encourage you at some point, get to an art museum that has a Mark Rothko painting in it and experience it, because I get it once I saw it in real life. So earlier in his career, Rothko's palette was lighter, and over time, the colors started to grow darker, and he started to bring in darker browns and blacks and things like that. So you can kind of trace his style over time. It's getting a little bit darker as he goes. And this definitely connected to some of the things going on in his personal life. He suffered from depression. He had some health issues, and his marriages did not work out very well. So as towards the end of his life, his canvases started to get very dark in color. And I think this is very much a testament to how color can have a lot of impact on our emotions, and how there's a very strong connection between color and emotion and attitude and feelings. That was something that we talked about with color back when we started talking about the elements of art, and how in marketing, companies and things like that, and in graphic design, are making very strong color choices, and it's very much tied to emotions and mood and things like that. So there is some, things with Mark Rothko, how he talks about, these are supposed to tap into kind of these base human emotions that all humans, no matter where you're from, what culture or anything like that, we all experience at our base level, similar emotions. And that was really what he was tapping into, was these unifying, universal feelings that we all share as humans. Okay, so this is by Helen Frankenthaler, and she was an artist who was also involved with color field painting. And her approach was less about extending the inner world of the artist, like Jackson Pollock's, struggle to, tap into his unconscious and get it out through his gestures. And her work was more about exploring the connection between the color and the surface. Literally, like, how does this paint react with this canvas? So she put the canvas on the ground similarly to what Jackson Pollock did, but she did this technique that she called soak stain, where she would dilute the paint a lot and then just let it kind of pour it onto the canvas and let it just kind of soak in. So you've got these like flowy lines and splotches and splatters, and kind of how they move around on the canvas. So it's a little bit like action painting in that it is kind of the evidence of an event, like her pouring the paint on the canvas, but it's these large, colorful floating shapes. So it's kind of this connection between both action painting and color field painting. Okay, so we're going to look at some sculpture, some constructed sculpture and assemblage. Components of construction sculpture might include materials such as rods, bars, tubes, planks, dowels, blocks, fabric, wire, thread, glass, plastic, and machined geometric solids. Assemblage refers to works that are constructed but from found objects. So that's a quick little review, because we've talked about constructed sculpture and assemblage sculpture when we talked about three-dimensional artwork. We are looking at a sculpture by David Smith, and he is considered one of the sculptors of abstract expressionism, and a lot of sculptors from this style were working in a very non-objective or very abstract style where their works bore little or no resemblance to objects in the visible world. And so David Smith's work started off as figurative sculpture, and then he was moving into this kind of non-objective type sculpture, as you see. So we're looking at just these arrangements of geometric forms. His style is kind of described as drawing in space. So he's does these kind of signature sculptures, meaning like this is what he's known for best, with these highly kind of burnished reflective surfaces. So you can kind of see that maybe that gestural effect by moving the tool around on the surface of the metal is something maybe similar to the action painting, but then the idea of just using these very basic geometric forms and not referencing anything recognizable in real life is, that non-objective component that we've also been seeing in abstract expressionism. This is a work by Nancy Graves, and I think it's a nice counterpoint to the work of David Smith, because her work is also assemblage in the sense that it's made up from a lot of the kind of strange and human-made and natural elements. She has like a lampshade and some tools and machinery, packing materials, a lampshade, some plants. So she has a variety of objects in here. This particular sculpture is called tarot, which refers to the cards that are used in somewhat, it's kind of fortune telling. And so this particular piece, she's got a lot of different textures going on and a lot of different colors happening. So not quite as much of the that really basic pure color solidarity that David Smith's work has. There's a lot more kind of like visual busyness on Nancy Graves' sculpture. Some artists remained strong in their commitment to the figure, to nature, or to visible reality, even as they integrated some elements of the New York school. And other artists explored the boundaries of abstraction. Like, how far can we go? So we're going to look at this commitment to representing the figure here with the painting by Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was a British artist who often reworked some themes by previous artists like Giotto or Rembrandt or Van Gogh. So the painting that we are looking at, called Figure with Meat, is actually kind of a reconstructed painting by the artist Velázquez, who did a portrait of Pope Innocent X. And so he's kind of redoing it in a much different way. So we have the figure of the Pope who has this open mouth, kind of expression, and he is positioned in front of two slabs of beef, which are kind of just right behind him. The entire painting has these kind of drippy effects, or almost like there's maybe like a curtain or a veil covering the figure and the slabs of beef. It's not totally clear what the purpose of the meat and the Pope combo is. A lot of the interpretations between his work is that it's kind of his response to contemporary life. I will be honest and tell you that some of Francis Bacon's paintings look like, like what I would imagine would work well in a horror movie. They are a little bit, a little bordering on the creepy factor, like this one with the meat Pope painting. Okay, and we are going to shift dramatically, where we're going to talk about Frank Stella. So Frank Stella's work is a departure from abstract expressionism in the sense that it's very precise and controlled and has somewhat of a purity of form. So he is known for hard-edged geometric abstraction, meaning you can very much clearly see the lines and the shapes in his work. This particular painting is called More or Less, and Frank Stella very much had the philosophy of what you see is what you see. So his non-objective works are very much non-gestural and not emotional like the action painters and the color field painters. So there's no kind of spontaneity or anything like that. It's very methodical and seems to have, very disciplined application of paint. And it's definitely different from that kind of primal impulse painting that we saw with Jackson Pollock and some of the artists like him. You might have noticed that the work by Frank Stella was a canvas that was not a usual rectangle or square shape. And that was called a shaped canvas. And the Elizabeth Murray painting that we are looking at is also a shaped canvas. She's a little bit more of a recent artist, but she works in the same kind of abstraction style as Frank Stella. This canvas is actually made up of 3 pieces and it's all shaped. And she talks about the fact that this is narrative about her and her siblings. So 3 canvases represent her and her 2 other siblings, as well as the fact that this artist has 3 children. So this is a little bit more narrative. The yellow shape is a shape of a teacup. So it has some very personal and family connections to the artist, which is a little bit different from the Stella painting, which, remember, he said, what you see is what you see, just shapes, lines, canvas. Whereas Elizabeth Murray has some more personal content to her work. And then we're going to come back to an artist who is a sculptor here before we move on from this little group of artists. This is Henry Moore's work. He was a sculptor. He was British, and he often is known for his abstract figurative sculpture. Often it's they're reminiscent of like the human body, sometimes reclining, sometimes sitting, and most of his work is either carved from wood or cast into bronze. And a lot of his work is often installed outside because of its monumental size and durability with the fact that it's cast into bronze. So what you can see in a lot of his work is the connection with negative space. There's often a lot of holes through his work, and so you're not only considering the forms that are there in the positive space, but also the negative space as well. Okay, now we're going to move on to pop art, and we're moving into the 1960s and 1970s, and it's important to remember that these are going to be several kinds of different styles of art that are happening at the same time, and that a lot of them are going to be pushing back against abstract expressionism. A lot of abstract expressionism is often considered to be very emotional and egocentric, so although it does look very non-objective and often just looks like paint on a canvas, it was often considered the artist working through their own personal turmoil or emotions. Often, like I mentioned with Mark Rothko, he's trying to tap into these universal emotions. So it's often considered very emotional and I guess kind of somewhat personal for the artists, like their own personal struggle with the canvas or whatever. And so a lot of the artwork that we're going to look at moving forward is pushing back against that. And we're going to start with pop art. Pop art relies on universal images of popular culture, such as movie posters, billboards, magazine and newspaper photographs, and advertisements. Through their selection of commonplace and familiar objects, pop artists challenged commonplace conceptions about the meaning of art. And we're going to start with what is considered one of the very first pop art works of art. This is by Richard Hamilton. And pop art actually started in the United Kingdom. This artist, Richard Hamilton, created this collage. So this is images cut from magazines and newspapers and things like that. It's called Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing? And you can see through here just kind of a little slice of life of images from maybe like 1950s British and American life. So there's a family, or there's two figures cut out. There is a third figure, the woman up on the top of the stairs who's vacuuming. The rug that is in the background is actually a Jackson Pollock painting, like a reproduction that's been turned into kind of the rug. So you have an image of the moon space at the very top of the collage. You've got things through the window that you can see, displaying some movies and things like that in the background. You've got even references to food, like the Tootsie Roll Pop, comic books, things like that. So pop culture very much relies on things that are from popular pop art, relies on things that are common and well known in pop culture. This is a work by the artist Robert Rauschenberg, and he is an American artist who studied in Paris and studied at the Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which is known for affecting and producing a lot of modern artists during this time period. And he started off with abstract expressionism and then moved into what is known as a combine painting, where he is somewhat combining painting and sculpture. So he often has articles of clothing, furniture, scraps of photographs. He paints on them. He's done printmaking on them. It's very much multimedia. So this is called the bed, and it is a paint splashed quilt and pillow, and it's mounted upright on the wall as a canvas might be hanging, like as a traditional painting might be hanging on the wall. So here, Robert Rauschenberg is playing around with traditional relationships between materials and form and content, right? This is something that we recognize, a bed. That's something that we all have connections to. We understand what it is, blankets, things like that. And then we have the idea of, instead of a canvas, we have a quilt and a pillow. And it's certainly challenging our notions of what a traditional painting might be. He has other work where he's actually incorporated like a taxidermied animal and a car tire, things like that. So he brings in pre-existing objects and works them into his paintings / sculptures. Jasper Johns was actually one of Rauschenberg's classmates at the Black Mountain College, and so they started their careers very much at the same time. And Jasper John's early work was also around some similar stuff to the brushwork of abstract expressionism with found objects. And soon he transitioned to making an object essentially the central part of his composition. So he has done a lot of American flag paintings. He's done a lot of map paintings, like maps of the United States, numbers, targets. Targets are one of his most well-known kind of motifs that he often paints of. So the idea is that he is using imagery that we are all familiar with, the idea of a flag or a map or a target, very identifiable images, and making paintings of them. And the one that we are looking at here is 3 flags, and it is painted with encaustic, which is liquid wax and pigment. And it also has these canvases that are different sizes as well. And so you get, a texture from the wax, things like that. And so, you're not looking at an actual flag, you're looking at a painting of a flag. So it's the idea of, rethinking objects and like, the idea that this is not that thing, it's just a painting of the thing. Okay, and we are now moving to Andy Warhol, who's probably one of the most well-known of the pop artists. He started off in more commercial art, working as an illustrator and even just working as a department store window dresser. And then he moved into his career as just a fine artist. He is very well known for also appropriating recognizable things into his work, like Jasper Johns. However, with Andy Warhol, it's often products such as Coca-Cola bottles, soup cans. He's done boxes of soap where he reproduced, just essentially made box the packaging for objects, just redoing them, exactly as they would appear at the store. And so the idea is that he is trying to make us question what we consume as well as what we view to be art. Andy Warhol is also well known for his images of public figures such as Marilyn Monroe, Jackie Kennedy. He even did some political leaders such as Mao Zedong. And sometimes those were paintings, and then often he did silkscreen printing. Remember when we learned about silkscreen printing, the idea was that it started off as a commercially used art form to produce signs and posters and things like that. And Andy Warhol, as well as some other artists at this time, liked the kind of commercial look that screen printing gave their work. And so they incorporated those. So a lot of Warhol's work is also done with screen printing to take out that human element to it. There's a lot that can be said about Warhol's reproduction of these images. The fact that he did, soda bottle after soda bottle and the soup cans over and over and over again. The idea is just possibly, some comments on consumerism, but also just connecting the idea with media and saturation of images, saturation of objects and items that we consume and people that we look at in media. So he's playing around with those ideas of, like how much we are bombarded with these images and objects. George Chagall was a pop art sculptor who's known for casting his figures in plaster from live models. And often they get set up in kind of little, unusual places. And so they might be, constructed with often other objects as well, like maybe a soda machine or pieces of a pickup truck. And some of his work extends beyond the museum or a gallery space and into the realm of public art. So the ones that are outside, like the image that we're looking at, originally they were cast in plaster and then later on cast into bronze so that they could be installed in an outdoor space and not completely fall apart with the weather. And some of the ones that are in the public realm have some deeper meanings to them in terms of where their placement is, such as he did one that was a group of people standing in a line, like a bread line, essentially waiting for food handouts. And it's it's supposed to reference the Great Depression in the 1930s, and it was installed in Washington, D.C. And then the one that we are looking at here was installed in Greenwich Village in New York, and it has to do with Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village when the members of the gay community engaged in violent protests against a raid on the Stonewall Inn by Manhattan police. So this work was commissioned by an art patron to commemorate that event. So these, moving into some bigger issues more than maybe what we think of with pop art in terms of just like looking at consumer culture and popular items. But his work gets into a little bit more of like popular issues or things that are happening in the world around him and other people at this time. So part of pop art was about the objective portrayal of familiar images. And we have during the early 1970s a movement called photorealism, where we have an attempt by artists to reproduce things with sharp photographic precision. And certainly realism is not a style that we are unfamiliar with. It's, reproducing objects with precision is something that's been a strong tradition in the arts. So photorealism that started gaining recognition in the early 1970s represented a new endeavor to depict things with sharp photographic precision, like I mentioned, and it was part of a reaction to the expressionistic and abstract movements of the 20th century. So we are looking at a portrait by Alice Neal, and she was an artist who did not do commissions, but rather handpicked the people that she wanted to paint from all areas of society, sometimes painting them like this family just sitting, and sometimes some of the paintings of the portraits are of people in the nude or semi-nude. And what is I guess interesting about her work is how undramatic it is in the sense that it's very stark and unflinching realism. She doesn't try to idealize people at all. She's kind of got, she's painting people realistically. Sometimes they have a little bit of non-local color on them, like on some of the faces of these sitters, just it's not super overly blended and made to be all perfect, but they are very much just depicting the people as they looked in real life. Okay, and here is a work by the artist Audrey Flack. She was from New York and did a lot of figure paintings that at the time that she was going to school and starting her career, she was doing figure paintings, but they were somewhat ignored because abstract expressionism at that time was all the rage. So she continued and persisted to do this very sharply realistic, or we can call it that trompe l'oeil style, right? It fools the eye, looks so highly realistic. A lot of her canvases are quite large. If you look at the dimensions on this one, it's 96 inches, which is about 8 feet by 8 feet. So they are very large and very realistic canvases. And a lot of times she would project onto the canvases to do some sketching as well, to be able to get them to be quite that large. She's known for kind of the lush textures that she's able to depict in terms of just the shininess of the beads, the waxiness of the candle, the flesh of the fruit. She is just masterful in how she can depict this. And some of her work, this particular one, which is World War II Vanitas, a lot of her works connect back to artwork that was frequently found in the 16th and 17th centuries. Vanitas paintings were often paintings with objects that helped remind the viewer about mortality and the idea that eventually we are all headed for the same place, but this is how we should be living while we are here. This one in particular references World War II with the title, with the Holocaust and the Jewish star that you see there, and the images of people from the concentration camp. So while very visually stunning and just, a master of reproducing textures and things like that. This one in particular has some deeper meaning to it as well. Okay, now we're going to look at the sculptor Dwayne Hansen. And Dwayne Hansen is an American artist who makes sculptures that are kind of the sculptural version of Audrey Flack's work in that trompe l'oeil effect. He uses liquid polyester resin to create very realistic human sculptures and dresses them in real clothes and things like that. And often they are kind of surprising if you come into a museum and kind of come into a gallery space or whatever and come a corner and you come into contact with them, because they are life-size, they are highly realistic, and often they are kind of characters that he has kind of maybe in some ways a little tongue-in-cheek poking fun at. This one is called Tourist. He has done several tourist sculptures where maybe he's kind of poking fun at people and all their gear and what we look like maybe when we're touring around. Some of them are comments or just kind of acknowledging consumer culture and just kind of a little bit of that pop culture reference that just like the things that are popular today, the stuff that we recognize. This is very much Dwayne Hansen's kind of he's in that same kind of realm. And this is the work by Chuck Close. He is best known for his methods of painting the face, the very large scale portraits. This one is, it doesn't have the dimensions on it, but it is very large. Oh, it does in the textbook. It's 107 inches tall. So it's over 9 feet tall. And so this is a self-portrait of himself when he was younger. And he was able to do these very large portraits by starting with a photograph and gridding it out, and then drawing a grid on his canvases and kind of transferring it over. If you've ever done a grid drawing, it helps you to put things in the right spots by having that grid on there. So this particular self-portrait is him kind of with his unkempt hair. He's got his cigarette in his mouth. This is very much kind of just like, here I am. This is me. So they are very realistic. He is another artist like Audrey Flack who have a very uncanny ability to reproduce textures in terms of skin and hair and things like that. If you see these paintings in real life, they're just like amazing to be able to get close to and just see how realistic they are. Chuck Close, his health deteriorated over time, but he was still able to continue to paint with the assistance of some grips that could help hold his paintbrushes, because he actually lost the ability to really grip a brush with his hand. So he started in his older age. He did portraits still, but they were they kind of like gridded out, and they were kind of like these little circular shapes. So it was kind of a commitment to portraiture throughout his whole artistic career. Okay, we're moving on to minimalism. Minimalists sought to reduce their ideas to their simplest forms. They created geometric shapes or progressions of shapes or lines using minimal numbers of formal elements. For example, the minimum amount of colors and textures. They did not attempt to represent objects or figures. Well, Frank Stella, the painter that we looked at a little while ago, is kind of the the beginner of minimalism. Donald Judd is a sculptor who very much embodies the idea of minimalism. Donald Judd often does basic geometric forms repeated. Sometimes they're installed on a wall. This particular one is 100 identical metal boxes in in the space, and they are the space between them varies, but they are literally all identical. The boxes are all the same, and so the shapes and materials are fabricated in factories from industrial or non-traditional materials, and Donald Judd doesn't actually make them. They're made by skilled workers, and so he gives them the directions and they make them. So this traditional relationship between the idea of the art and its creation is somewhat subverted, and that's something that we're going to continue to see in some other artists. Andy Warhol is another artist who sometimes did not create his own work. He had a team of people and he would give them instructions. Sometimes on purpose, he would give them vague instructions just to see what they would do with it. And so there are artists who are moving more to, you had more about the idea and not so much about what they actually physically do. Okay, so now we're going to talk about performance art. So performance art privileged action over object, public spaces over museum settings, the impermanent over the permanent, and often audience participation over passive spectatorship. Most of the pioneering work in performance art is memorialized only in still photographs, if at all. Today, a subgenre of performance art is performance video. Such works are scripted and often feature elaborate staging and special effects. The roots of performance art began in the late 1950s and early 1960s with spontaneous events turned happenings. And these pieces would sometimes be the result of the interactions between the artist / performer and the audience. And Alan Caprow is one of the earliest proponents of performance art. He said that the line between art and life should be kept as fluid and perhaps as indistinct as possible. So this is actually a recreation of one of his performance pieces or happenings. This one is where people are using blocks of ice to assemble a rectangular enclosure. So some often they were not scripted in terms of what was going to happen, but sometimes the performances arts are scripted. This is another early piece in the rise of performance art. This is called Homage to New York, and it's by Jean Tingley. And it was in the outdoor sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. It happened on March 16th, 1960 from 6:30 to 7 p.m. And the centerpiece was this 23-foot long, 27-foot high contraption constructed of objects. This artist was a kinetic sculptor, meaning he would make sculptures that had the potential to move. They actually had moving parts. So this contraption that he made was a meteorology balloon that was filled with colored gas, a bathtub, a piano, a go-kart, bicycle wheels, and it had a lot of electrical motors. So it was advertised as a self-constructing and self-destroying work of art. And it was this one night only performance. I don't think that there's any, film of it. We only have these photographs, but the idea is that it would like spin and clink and spark and essentially, I guess, would have utterly self-destructed itself if it and had some flames on it involved, and then the fire department had to get involved. So it's the idea that it was a very unpredictable event, and like that unpredictability became part of the work. The artist Yoko Ono is probably more known for being the wife of the Beatles singer and songwriter John Lennon, but she was an established artist prior to joining that that crew. And one of her early works that she's known for is a piece called Cut Piece, where she is wearing a black dress. She comes onto the stage. She has scissors on the floor. And when she says the word cut, people are invited to come onto the stage and cut pieces of her clothing away, like the dress. And so as the scissors get closer to her body, it becomes a little bit more, threatening and invasive. And so people kind of started to, her body was the art object, her body was the medium. And so it was pretty groundbreaking in the idea of performance art, conceptual art. And it was also, she's known for making work about feminist issues as well. The image that we are looking at is one of the performance pieces that John Lennon collaborated with her. It was part of their 1960s peace campaign. The title of it, Bagism, was intended to erase distinctions among individuals and, in doing so, erase prejudice, gender, race, or class, and promote tolerance. And we're going to look at the artist Marina Abramovic. And just moving from Yoko Ono's performance art, the awareness of the vulnerability of her body was maybe disconcerting and disturbing for her audience as well as maybe for her. And Marina Abramovic is an artist who uses her body and her as the subject and the medium as well. And she often really pushes the limits of physical and psychological art and just as well as pushing the limits between the performance and the audience relationship. Some of her earlier pieces can possibly involve injury to herself, where she had a piece where she jabbed a knife rhythmically between her fingers, which were spread out on a table. And then if she, every time she drew blood, she had to pick up a new knife. There was another piece that she did with another artist that they had sat very, very close to each other, breathing in and out, and they breathed each other's carbon dioxide until eventually they had their lungs filled with carbon dioxide and they fell unconscious. So it was, like I mentioned, pushing the boundaries with like what her body can do in the art arena. The image that we are looking at, called The Artist is Present, this took place at the Museum of Modern Art from March 14th to May 31st, 2010. And this was about focus and endurance. She sat at this table completely still, completely silent for 736 hours and 30 minutes. And museum goers were invited one at a time to come and sit across from her for as long as they wanted during the museum's open hours of operation. So you could just essentially sit there and stare at her, and she would stare at you. Okay, so we're moving towards conceptual art. And the conceptual art movement began in the 1960s, asserts that art lies in the mind of the artist. The visible or the audible or the palpable product is merely an expression of the artist's idea. Conceptual art challenges the traditional definition of art as involving technical mastery of a craft. So we have seen some examples of this just prior in this lecture with Donald Judd and Andy Warhol. Artists are thinking more about the art as the idea and not so much about what they are doing, to what they're producing. Traditionally, art has been a product, or the artist has been expected to, quote unquote, master his or her craft, painting, sculpture, whatever it is. And we have seen some artists who have started, the ball rolling with conceptual art, just in terms of Marcel Duchamp taking an object and just labeling it as art, calling it a ready-made. We've seen, even Michelangelo, who said, like, the sculpture's already in that block of stone. I just have to take away what isn't part of that. So, where then is the art in terms of, if it's already in there, what's Michelangelo doing? So we're starting to really come into some, new notions of art and artist, and how much you actually do in terms of the product for the artist. This is a work by Joseph Kosuth, and it's called 1 and 3 Chairs, and it is a 3-part piece. So you have the object itself, the chair, a photograph of the object, and the dictionary definition of the object. And so the artist displays what he considers to be the concept of chairness as it exists in his mind. It is not the execution of the art that the art exists. So we have no painting or drawing or anything like that. We don't even have a found object that's converted into art. Is like literally just the chair is a chair. The photograph is a photograph of the chair. The definition is the definition. So it kind of goes back to Frank Stella with saying, like, what you see is what you see. So it's a chair. Barbara Kruger is going to help us as we start moving into some feminist art. She's a kind of a good bridge into that realm. She is an artist who incorporates words into her art pieces. So in this one, she is confronting male and female viewers with kind of stereotypical epithets for the dominant sex that kind of seem to criticize females for feeding male expectations as much as for males having them. So she's using a Norman Rockwell illustration, and Norman Rockwell was an artist who is known for his kind of Americana images. And so you have this little girl kind of looking at the muscles of the boy, and so she's taken that, but she's plastered over it this phrase like, we don't need another hero. And so it's the idea over the object. So it's not so much like what art stuff did Barbara Kruger do, but it's more about her idea and what she's trying to do. She's trying to bring up issues of power and feminism, and she is kind of showing this traditional masculine feminine gender roles. That's what a lot of her work addresses, and traditional power structures, and questioning all that. So we're going to be moving into some artwork about art, identity, and social consciousness. And so we're going to start with feminist art. So while on the East Coast, pop art was on the wane and photorealism was on the rise, events on the West Coast were about to change the course of women's art, history, and criticism. Feminist art explores the role of gender in society, including in the arts. And we've seen a couple pieces by Miriam Shapiro this semester. She is an artist who often works with objects or things that reference maybe traditional women's crafts or arts or just even women's roles. This is a 3-dimensional piece that incorporates like sculpture as well as drawing and painting, and this is about women's experiences. The piece that we're looking at, the dollhouse, was part of a larger installation in which Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, we'll talk about Judy Chicago in just a moment, refurbished each room of a dilapidated mansion in Valencia, California. And each of the rooms were decorated with a kind of a theme about women's experiences. And so this is just one of the pieces that was installed in in the house. So this was this house actually served as a place for women's groups, and actually was the beginning for the founding of the Los Angeles Women's Building, which is something that's still active today. So Now let's look at Judy Chicago's work, The Dinner Party. So Judy Chicago was an artist who worked collaboratively as well, like Miriam Shapiro did in the previous work. And this work is multimedia, and the idea was to honor and immortalize history's notable women. So the idea is that it's this dinner party where the guests of honor have these place settings. And so this took a lot of volunteers and a lot of time where to make each place setting has a placemat, a cup, a plate, and silverware, and it goes back into space, back in history in terms of women who come from mythology as well as historical women we actually know really existed. And so each of the pieces kind of honors them and celebrates them. And then down on the floor, the tiles have an additional 999 names of additional women as well. So the idea is that these artists are working hard to really bring some attention to the significant role of women in both arts and society. This work by Anna Mendieta is another performance piece, and Arbol de la Vida means tree of life. And part of this was somewhat, shock value. In this piece, she presents her own body draped in mud, and it's called an earth body sculpture against the craggy bark of a tree. Similarly to other women artists, Mendieta shunned painting. She didn't really want to do something that was historically associated with male artists and male values. So in this piece, she tied her flesh and blood instead across time and cultures to the ancient myth of the Earth Mother goddess. A lot of the feminist art that is happening here is trying to call attention to the ways in which women artists have been largely ignored by critics and curators and art historians, and this pressure to work in the kind of canon style, essentially like fitting into the pre-existing male dominated canon of art history. And so sometimes through their work was specifically designed to have some shock value to it, some exaggeration to draw attention to the lack of female representation, and also to draw attention to women's experiences, and the sense that they are not necessarily aligned with the male view or interests in terms of what they want to depict in their artwork. And one of the groups that is very well known for doing this are the Guerrilla Girls. And the Guerrilla Girls are late 1970s, early 80s. It's a group of women artists who banded together and set out to draw attention to the lack of female representation in the art world. They only appear wearing gorilla masks when they appear in public, and they use pseudonyms after famous women artists. So the image on the left is one of their posters, and it's often tongue in cheek in terms of maybe being sarcastic or things like that. So the advantages of being a woman artist include things like working without the pressure of success, and things like that. And they are often trying to draw attention to the lack of females in museums and gallery spaces and things like that. And we'll just mention that the image on the right of the slide is from 1993. It's from a cover story for the New York Times Magazine, picturing the art world all-stars. And you'll notice that they are all white men.
So, the inequality still exists, and the Gorilla Girls also still exist. Here is a picture of them from the 80s on the right side. That's often how they appear. Many of the women, there's a few of them that are kind of the original members, and then there have been some that have kind of come and gone and joined the group over the years. They are all working artists in their, I guess, their real life, and then they don't ever reveal their true names. They, like I mentioned, they go by pseudonyms. The other image shows one of their famous images, and you might recognize that Grand Odalisque that's wearing a gorilla mask. And, it's just drawing attention to the fact that the percentage of artists represented in, the Metropolitan Museum of New York City are, the percentage are quite low, but 85% of the nudes are females. So women are maybe represented, just not with clothes on. And we'll wrap up just our look at feminist art with Ghada Amir, who is a contemporary artist. She's originally from Egypt and lived in France for a while, and now lives and works in New York. And she has work that comments on war, clash of cultures, the subjection of women in domestic roles, and male domination of the art world. And one of the things her work also addresses is her celebration of women's sexuality. So the image that we are looking at, naughty but nice, kind of a play on words there with knots, because part of this is an embroidered piece. This is a presentation of images of women from pornographic magazines in erotic poses. So you may not even really at first glance have seen that, but if you start to look a little bit closer, you'll start to see that kind of the outlines of the bodies. And it's done kind of in a way to have this embroidery and line work that's all kind of crossing and making it difficult to kind of really make out the figures. And like the question, why is this a feminist work? It seems to kind of perpetuate some of the female nude images that we've seen. The answer in some ways is that, women, like men, can enjoy sex. And also, the suggestion that sometimes that male gaze can be somewhat predatory. And I'll wrap this up with a quote from Amir that I think is pretty powerful. It says, "The history of art was written by men, in practice and in theory. Painting has a symbolic and dominant place inside this history. And in the 20th century, it became the major expression of masculinity, especially through abstraction." Side note, think abstract expressionism. "For me," this is Ghada Amir speaking, "the choice to be mainly a painter and to use the codes of abstract painting is occupying a territory that has been denied to women historically. But I integrate in this male field a feminine universe, that of sewing and embroidery." So, as women have sought to express their individuality and social concerns through art, so have members of the LGBT community. And Robert Mapplethorpe created many black and white images of people struggling in a world that was hostile to them because of their sexual identity. Robert Mapplethorpe was a photographer who is known for working primarily in black and white. He has beautiful photographs that, if you are primarily just discussing them in terms of the elements of art and principles of design, it is very easy. He is an artist who clearly knows how to compose a photograph, work with elements and principles in terms of shape, line, contrast, things like that. This particular image has some strong contrast in it with Ken Moody and Robert Sherman. So that's certainly, understandable. Robert Mapplethorpe also pushed the boundaries in terms of the art world, and accepted images that could be counted as art. And he really kind of shook that up and took it to a place with some famous explicit erotic images. So just as a precursor, if you decide to investigate Robert Mapplethorpe further, part of what he was doing was bringing awareness and some of the gay culture from the 1960s and 70s to the forefront. So he was an artist who was really challenging just our idea of the nude and erotic art and things like that. The post war era in the United States was marked by the increasing exposure of the inequality between races. The dominant art movements of the 1950s and 1960s were almost exclusively white male. Few, if any, women artists or artists of color working in the mainstream idioms became familiar names, much less those whose visual images articulated racial and cultural difference. Many artists in the second half of the 20th century explored racial and ethnic identity through visual representation. Okay, so we're going to look at the work by Romare Bearden. He was an artist who was from a middle class family and attended the Art Students League in the New York University in the 1940s. He was very interested in music, specifically jazz and the blues, and he had a philosophy that African Americans should create their own art forms. He actually was an art teacher for a large part of his career before focusing exclusively on his art career. And he combined painting with collage as his kind of signature style. And this work that we're looking at, called The Dove, shows some cubist elements and some abstract expressionism, with the idea that it gives us a specific kind of African American lens to look at a Harlem street scene. So it's clipped images that are put together, some photographs, just some different colors of paper. And so it's somewhat, if you think about cubism with the fractured space and multiple perspectives at the same time, that's maybe something that we get here with the collage thing. There's not really a uniform perspective. It's kind of showing things from all different particular vantage points, but we see lots of different activities going on. And this is somewhat kind of like a little scrapbook of memories of growing up. You see people interacting and different shapes and sizes of things. And a lot of his work did include jazz elements to it. So he was very interested in music. So a lot of his work also is just specifically music themed. Okay, and here's one of the story quilts by Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold was from Harlem in New York City. She was raised with a social conscience just in her growing up. Her early work is mostly paintings, and it was definitely concerned with civil rights and feminist themes. I wish I had put in some pictures of her early paintings. I absolutely love her early painting style. It's very powerful. I would encourage you just Google, Faith Ringgold paintings. If you think, when you look at these story quilts and you think oh, it's all just kind of like vanilla and, easy to look at or whatever, her painting is a little bit more intense. But she started going into incorporating quilting as a art form and as a storytelling medium. So she made these really big narrative quilts that tell a story. This one is called Tar Beach. There's a illustrated book that you can get that has the whole story with the pictures from her quilts. They are full-sized quilts. They take up a large amount of space. If you look at the dimensions, they're very large. So they're painted and they're quilted pieces. They have the story often printed on them. And this particular one is somewhat autobiographical, talking about growing up in Harlem and spending time on the rooftop of the building building, and their families, memories and friends, and just the feelings of growing up. And it taps into the tradition of storytelling, which has a strong tradition in African American families, as well as quilting. And so she's bringing together a lot of the traditional art forms, as well as challenging the idea of, what is a painting, what is women's work, what is craft, what is art, that kind of thing. Jean-Michel Basquiat was an artist from New York who had Haitian and Hispanic heritage. He dropped out of high school at 17 and became pretty famous pretty quickly in his early 20s. And by the age of 27, he had passed away due to a drug overdose. He's now considered to be one of the most talented artists of his generation. And the textbook mentions that he's somewhat a symbolic casualty to the cycle of work, success, and burnout that might have been characteristic of the 1980s in the United States. He has a style that draws a lot from graffiti from New York City. He participated in graffiti at a young age, and he was actually mentored by Andy Warhol, who kind of just encouraged him, got him connections, maybe taught him a little bit just about material use. But Basquiat did a lot of collage type looking canvases. He combined photocopies, drawing, and painting. A lot of words show up in his work. And there's kind of a almost like a symbolic kind of alphabet for him in terms of things that you see repeated a lot. I think the phrase SAMO, like SAMO, and it kind of stands for like the same old stuff. Maybe like same old shit, that kind of stuff, like that. He shows up, and that's like a phrase that's in his work a lot, with a little crown. He's got somewhat of a a graffiti style, somewhat kind of drawing style that looks primitive, or not trained, but it is anything but, in terms of seeming like he's not aware of what he's doing. He is very choice based about where he's putting images, about his compositions, about his lines and things like that. The idea is, maybe to make it look like you might see this wall on a side of a building or something like that in New York City, and just like the layers and the drawings that would be there, maybe some words, things like that. And he does make references to the Black experience, and you can see on the left side of this particular canvas the reference to ancient Egyptian art with Eye of Horus. And so his work is somewhat symbolic, and there's lots of imagery and text that is very consciously chosen. Okay, now we're going to look at Kara Walker, and she was born in 1969. So, some of the artists that we're looking at right now certainly kind of came out of the second half of the 20th century and are very much so still alive. Jean-Michel Basquiat, not so, but Kara Walker is still alive and still an active artist. So right now we're just looking at this, we're kind of I'm reminding you that we're looking at artists who are dealing with specific issues and not necessarily part of an overarching kind of school or style, but just artists whose work tend to be about similar things. So Kara Walker does a particular kind of cutout style that actually has its roots in 19th century silhouettes. That was kind of somewhat of like a thing in the 19th century, with doing these silhouette images, like portraits of just the side of someone's face, like a profile view, things like that. But she kind of picks that up, that kind of style, and uses that in her work a lot. She works at a very large scale, so a lot of times these cutouts are life size, and they're put on backgrounds. Sometimes they are actually projected into a space, like an installation kind of environment, but more often than not, it's cut paper. And you can, this particular one that we're looking at is cut paper silhouettes and a light projection. So the background is actually the projected part. And a lot of the subjects of her work have to do with race relations in the United States. They are sometimes done in a way that have been considered controversial, both to people of of color as well as people who are white, and that's because she uses stereotypical imagery sometimes to draw attention to the traditional stereotypes that have existed in the Black community. And sometimes people find that the fact that she is continuously using those, that she is helping to perpetuate them. Whereas in her view, she's bringing them up to draw attention to the stereotypes that have existed for African Americans in the United States. So meaning she's somewhat of a controversial artist. And her work are quite large. Sometimes her imagery is a little more graphic, and kind of recounting some of the more grisly events from things like slavery in the United States. Kehinde Wiley is another artist who is working at a large scale as well. And Kehinde Wiley is a painter who often remixes famous paintings from the past. So what we have right here is, you can see his not so much a version of Jacques Louis David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps, but his kind of using that as a starting point. So Kehinde Wiley does not use famous people as his models. He actually finds people out and about on the street. He'll just walk up to people that he does not know, people who are not famous, and he allows them oftentimes to look through an art history book and choose the pose that they want to be depicted in. So in this case, the painting on the right is Kehinde Wiley's painting. It is a very large scale. You can see it's 9 feet by 9 feet. And it is using the kind of structure of the Jacques Louis David painting to put African Americans into these traditional large scale paintings that maybe they would not have ever found themselves in before. So the tradition of history painting and large scale portrait painting was not something that was traditionally done for people of color. And Kehinde Wiley is changing that. He paints in a very realistic style. He often will do a background that is highly patterned, floral, and he talks about that he wants to bring that kind of pomp and circumstance to portraiture in a way that that has not traditionally been available to people of color. Kehinde Wiley is an artist from somewhat pretty modest means who grew up with a single mother raising him and his brothers, and took art classes just as something that he was interested in, and then quickly developed a talent and went to very good art schools, and he's quickly risen in the art world to be a pretty well known. He was chosen by Barack Obama to do a portrait of Obama. You may Google that and see it. Kehinde Wiley is another artist that I think if you see his work in real life, you'll be astounded. Most of his work is really large and just really beautiful in the sense the way that he paints colors and textures and skin tones is just they're very beautiful to look at, and not only about the aims behind them, just in terms of bringing greater representation in galleries and museums to people who traditionally have not been in those spaces. And then we're gonna wrap up our category to this one with Jean Quitessy Smith, who is a Native American artist. And she grew up on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana. Much of her work is about her Native American heritage, and you can see in this work probably some influence from Robert Rauschenberg, just in the style that she does a lot of layering with mixed media compositions, with images and words and paint and physical objects as well. So this is a 14-foot long canvas with a canoe shape depicted in the center and lots of paint on the background. And the textbook talks about how the red kind of dripping down has somewhat of a connection, or kind of brings to mind the blood that was spilt by the European conquerors of Native Americans. And through the transparent layers, there's some photographs, some representations of Native Americans by white illustrators and photographers. There's newspaper clippings that report the conditions, past and present, from murderous events of conquest to the poverty and alcoholism that are existent on modern day reservations. And then across the top, you have these kind of objects that, you might find at like a souvenir stand that make reference to Native American stuff, like a toy tomahawk or a feather headdress. There's, some baseball caps that have the logos on them that are connected to kind of stereotypical images of Native Americans that often Native Americans and non-Native Americans find somewhat offensive and racist. And the title of the painting, the Gifts for Trading Land with the White People, kind of references, like what the Native Americans got in terms of they got junk in return for the appropriated land. Okay, we're going to move on to talking about some other paintings. In 1978, New York's Whitney Museum mounted a controversial, though significant exhibition of new image painting. These artists reconciled disparate styles of abstraction and representation. Images were central to their compositions, but they were so simplified that they conveyed the grandeur of abstract shapes. So we're going to see a period of pluralism of artistic styles that also reflected the growing pluralism in contemporary society in the wake of civil rights movements and feminist movements. So we're going to look at two of the artists from this new image painting that was an important exhibit at the Whitney Museum. And this one is Jennifer Bartlett. And in this painting, she's combining narrative, like storytelling, with conceptual art, representation, because we see things that we recognize, and some abstract process painting, as well as some sculpture. So this particular painting / sculpture has some flames that are kind of engulfing some objects that are actually, and then some of the objects are actually kind of repeated as sculptures on the floor. So the title and the work invite the viewer to kind of speculate as to what exactly that has happened. The title of this is Spiral: An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. So, oh my gosh, what happened, right? And we have all of these objects kind of throughout the canvas. So it's both kind of a combination of sculpture and painting. And so you can see, as we mentioned, this kind of pluralism with the idea of, some styles, some conceptual art, some painting. It's not completely abstract. It's not completely figurative. We're getting into kind of where all of these styles we've been talking about are starting to overlap and kind of and combine. Susan Rothenberg is an artist who is known for painting images of horses. That's kind of what she does, but she does it in somewhat of a minimalist style. So she does work that is very painterly in the sense that you can see the brush strokes on the canvas, but also the shapes are loose enough that they're very abstract and almost, borderline, could possibly be just turning into non-objective canvas. So she kind of crosses this boundary of image versus just paint on a canvas. And in this is not the one from the Whitney Museum exhibit, but this is a more recent work. And in this one, there's a disembodied forearm kind of reaching forward and holding the front leg of this colt. And so there's a balance between just kind of background, the positive space and the negative space, right? The background and the object that are in there, as well as a little bit of a story, but then also it leaves it very open as to, the story that you want to tell in your mind. What is this all about? It leaves it very open-ended. So I'm reminding you that the artist who kind of came up in New York City in the 1940s, in that first half of the 20th century, that developed abstract expressionism, were very much connected to the process of painting as a viable alternative to the subject matter, right? It was more about the event that happened with the paint on the canvas rather than painting a specific subject matter. Then there are artists who were born during that time who are coming up, and we are calling them the Neo-Expressionism. And they revived that gestural manner and experimentation with materials, but with an added dimension. These are artists who are not fans of making art about nothing. So it has some more content to it that might be more recognizable if you are looking a little bit deeper. So these artists portrayed the bitter ironies and angst of their generation in emotionally fraught images that are rooted in history, literature, and expressionistic art. So this is the work by Anselm Kiefer, and a lot of his work is based on his German heritage. He often references German history and culture. A lot of times his work is pretty intellectual, obscure, and sometimes a little hard to understand. So his work, maybe you've just seen it in the museum, you might kind of glance over it. And if you can put in the time to read the wall label and things like that, you'll probably be able to get a little bit more out of it. A lot of times they are quite large works of art. This particular work is a mixed media, and it has its basis in a poem that in English translates to Your Golden Hair, Marguerite. And it's about the destruction of European Jewry, not jewelry, but Jews. And so it has some reference to Jewish women with the hair that is depicted on the surface. And a lot of his work has three-dimensional components to it. He does combine sculpture and painting as well. A lot of times he scrawls his titles or other words across the canvases, and sometimes they're highly textured. So the materials help kind of function as the content, the meaning behind the work as well. And a lot of times his work is ones that have a lot of emotion, and some content behind them that you really have to spend a little bit of time with to fully understand. Eric Fischel is an American painter, and a lot of his subject matter focused on middle class life in the suburbs. And this particular painting that we are looking at is called A Visit to / A Visit from / the Island. And the suburban folks that he often paints are on an island vacation setting. And so while they are relaxing on the left hand side, in their very tranquil Caribbean vacation, oblivious to anything other than pleasure seeking, the native islanders on the right hand are drowning in the surf. So he is kind of drawing attention to the very different social structure that we often find in these vacation paradises. And this is something that is possibly unknown to people, and he's trying to bring attention to it. The idea that a lot of these large resort getaways that are kind of considered paradises for travelers and tourists are homelands to people who are often well below the poverty line in our state, and like our version. And so he's contrasting that, like joyousness with some more, uh, sad realities that often happen. So he paints in a pretty lush, realistic style, and a lot of his work has a strong narrative format that has like a story that goes with it. So now we're going to do a brief little tour of architecture since the middle of the 20th century. And since World War II, architecture has moved in a lot of different directions. We've had some advances in technology that allowed architects to get much taller buildings like the skyscraper, and have more sculptural forms in terms of the structure of the building. You have changes in landscape, just in the birth of vast housing spaces like Levittown. And so we're going to look at some modern architecture really briefly, just to kind of catch us up to where we are now. So modern architecture rejected the ideals and principles of a classic tradition in favor of experimental forms of expression. Modernism was inspired by the urge to depict contemporary life and events rather than history. Modern architects felt free to explore new styles inspired by technology and science, psychology, politics, economics, and social consciousness. Okay, and we're going to look at the example of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He's known mostly just as Mies van der Rohe, and the Farnsworth House. The important thing, I guess, if you're just trying to summarize what modern architecture, when we talk about modern architecture in the middle of the 20th century, just remember a rejection of any sort of reference to history. So in modern architecture, you are not going to see any columns from ancient Greek temples. You are not going to see any reference to the past. A lot of modern architecture is very clean lines, lots of metal, glass, and zero reference to the past. It is built on this urge to depict contemporary life, not acknowledge the past, and working with new technologies. So what we have with Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth house is this is in Illinois, and it has a really simple kind of clean lines. He's got a steel kind of frame for this house. It's less expensive than wood, and it has lots of walls of glass, which is also kind of a modern architecture characteristic. There is virtually no ornamentation on this house whatsoever, like no decorative little spirals or anything like that. You have these, like I mentioned, these walls of glass that allow the people inside to see the environment around them, kind of breaking down that barrier. Also, obviously, if they have all their curtains drawn, we can see right into their house as well. The idea is to let the environment kind of flow through the space. And we also have on the interior a breakdown in terms of less walls on the inside as well, more open flow on the inside. And this is the Seagram building that was designed by Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. And it was built as the United States headquarters for the Canadian distiller, Seagram and Sons. It's on it's in New York City, and this is another example of modern architecture. And they had the modernist kind of phrase for architecture is form ever follows function. So once again, we've got no ornamentation. We've just got these essentially vertical I-beams of bronze coated steel that form this really regular pattern. And then lots of the glass for those kind of walls of glass that I mentioned before. Mies van der Rohe hated irregularity. He wanted everything to be very uniform. You cannot have anything that looks chaotic or messy. It's very obviously orderly, grid-like. Down on the very bottom, you have these very sharp edge columns, and then it kind of transitions into a space with some trees and fountains, kind of very, very austere and pretty standard for modern architecture. By the end of the 1970s, architects continued to create steel cage structures, but drew freely from past styles of ornamentation, including classical columns, pediments, friezes, and a variety of elements from ancient Greece, Egypt, and Rome. This architectural movement, postmodernism, warmed up buildings, linking them to the architectural past. So essentially, we went so far in one direction. Everybody was worried that like these cities were just going to be super boring with these just grid like buildings, and that it was time to get back to bringing in a little bit of the past. So the modern architecture, zero reference to the past, very pared down, simple, no ornamentation. Postmodern architecture, we're bringing it back. So there's a resurgence of bringing in some shapes and some decorative elements from the past and putting that into a more modern sense. So the example that we have on this slide is actually designed by Philip Johnson and John Burgee, and it was the AT&T building. It was subsequently sold to Sony, but it is an example of postmodernism in the sense that you have this massive tower that sits on a whole bunch of columns, that kind of is reminiscent of that Egyptian hypostyle hall, and it has this really pale pink facade, and we have a little bit of irregularity, right? Some of the windows are different sizes than other ones. And then you've got this top of the building that is kind of crowned with this broken roof pediment, and it's actually supposed to be reminiscent of a Chippendale style furniture. So we have this, like this, bringing in a little ornamentation that has reference to furniture, and this steel cage structure that now is virtually disguised with like minor references to the past. Michael Graves' Humana building is another example of postmodern architecture, and also another building that looks to ancient Egypt for its historic reference. Once again, on the bottom, we've got a lot of tightly arranged pillars that look like an Egyptian hypostyle hall, and a grid of square windows up above that. And then up to the top part, the like the kind of massive structural stuff is reminiscent of the great pylons or gateways of Egyptian temple complexes. And so we've got kind of that curved shape at the top of the front that looks maybe like a little bit like a pharaoh headdress, like the crowns that the pharaohs would wear. And this is the Georges Pompidou National Center for Arts and Culture in Paris. And this building is really unique, and this fact that it has its skeleton on the outside, meaning that all of the pipes and the air conditioning ducts and the essentially all the things that normally are hidden on the interior of a building are on the exterior of the building. And at first, people really were critical of it and didn't like it because you could kind of see like all the the guts of the building. However, they are part of the facade of this building and allowed the architects to really do a lot of color on the outside because of all the pipes and things like that. Even the elevator shaft is on the outside. And so you have, and it's transparent, so you can actually see the people as they're going from floor to floor. So in this case, it's not necessarily looking to the past for like a decoration style, but in this case, kind of starting to move towards what we're going to call deconstruction, with the idea of kind of like putting the outside on the inside on the outside. So the world of architecture is currently enmeshed in a movement called deconstructivism. In deconstructivist architectural design, the whole is less important than the parts, and the buildings are meant to be seen in bits and pieces. Deconstructivist architects tend to reduce their structures to pure geometric forms that make it possible with contemporary materials, and they make liberal use of color to express emotion. And we've looked at some work that's been somewhat deconstructivist before. Frank Gehry is an architect who's definitely deconstructivist. He designed the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. That's a great example. And right now we're going to look at this example by Daniel Liebeskind, which is the Berlin Museum in Germany. So this section that he designed is actually the Jewish museum department of the Berlin Museum. And when you look at it from that aerial view, it's this zigzag or lightning bolt shape that resembles a broken Star of David. And the idea was derived mathematically by plotting the Berlin addresses of Jewish writers, artists, and composers who were killed during the Holocaust. So it has a very symbolic meaning behind the structure. And the overall design has these voids that symbolize the absence of Jewish people and culture in Berlin. And the exterior is this kind of zinc color, and it's slashed with linear patterns of windows. And that was determined by connecting the addresses of German and Jewish Berliners on a map of the museum's neighborhood. So the idea that, when you come to visit this, you should be the idea is to be kind of struck by the overwhelming sense that every structural design and symbolic element has been informed by the historic circumstance that gave rise to the building. So there's a lot of symbolism behind it. Zaha Hadid is one of the few women who have been extremely important in architecture in the recent years. She passed away in 2016, and architecture has not been a field that women have been able to access frequently. And additionally, she is from an Islamic society, so she comes from a culture that often restricts social and professional roles of women. So the fact that Zaha Hadid has had a global position, and she's won a lot of awards and she's been highly sought after is really notable. She was born in Baghdad and educated in London, where she continued to live for most of her life. And this particular building is called Dancing Towers, and it is in Dubai. So this one kind of resembles somewhat of a choreographed interlacing of abstract torsos. So it very much has a sense of movement to it. The three towers start on a common base, and then they kind of seem like they're doing their own thing, kind of interacting with the companion towers. And then on certain levels where the functions of the individual towers overlap, there's offices in here, a hotel, residences, leisure facilities, and restaurants. So the textbook talks about how the towers evoke the fluidity of the often referenced image of the three graces in art history, that connects to some ancient Greek mythology, in which a trio of beautiful women kind of intertwine in dance. And so their collective positions combining to create a single perfect form. So that's what you can kind of be thinking about with this particular building. Okay, and the last piece that we're going to look at is the World Trade Center Transportation Hub, but designed by Santiago Calatrava. And this is a transportation hub to replace one that was destroyed in the bombing of the World Trade Center towers. So this has been completed. I think the textbook kind of talks about, if you have the textbook and you're reading it, it talks a little bit about it, like it will be whatever, but it has actually been built. Calatrava is a sculptor and a painter, as well as an architect. And in this piece, he's very much erasing the lines between the idea of architecture and sculpture. And it's very much kind of resembles some sort of, thing in flight. And this is similar to New York Kennedy's Airport, that has a TWA terminal designed by Eero Saarinen that also has a very kind of bird in flight kind of vibe. And so most of Calatrava's hub is actually underground, but it has this really big piece of glass and steel at the top, with these canopies that stretch outward, creating that impression of the wings. And the practical purpose of that design is to bring a lot of natural light down onto the train platform. So this is essentially where, it's a subway station. And so Calatrava talks about light as one of the building materials that he uses. So thinking about how light can, be incorporated naturally is a big part of his designs. Okay, so we're going to move into some other countries now for the last part of this. The art of India and Pakistan. In 1947, the Dominion of India gained independence from the United Kingdom. Led by Mahatma Gandhi, India entered its post-colonial period. Gandhi further advocated for the alleviation of the deprivations experienced by India's lowest caste, and promoted amiable relations between Hindus and Muslims. In that same year, the British departed. India broke apart into two nations of the Union of India, majority Hindu, and the Dominion of Pakistan, which was primarily Muslim. In Bombay, which is now Mumbai, the Marxist-leaning progressive artist group rejected colonial stylistic idioms and embraced 20th century European modernism. And this is a good example of that embracing of European modernism, including things like Expressionism and Cubism and Surrealism. So in this painting from Hussein's Rajamala series, it references those European styles. You got some fragmented forms, some integration of foreground and background, right? Like you can't really necessarily see a difference between where the background starts. You have have a lot of expressive color and imagery that spreads from one edge of the canvas to the other. The subject matter, however, you can see some traditional Indian painting subject matter. So that's in contrast to some of the European paintings. So it has some references to art and poetry and music, and it's borrowing on traditional Indian painting, but kind of bringing it into a style that is more modern. And this painting, Yosemite 4, is an example of the influence of American painting on an Indian painter. So this one, Bhavsar lives in New York in the 1960s, and you can see some color field painting influence in there in terms of just saturation of colors across the canvas. It's completely non-objective. And the colors, however, are connected and to kind of the symbolic colors that are used in Hindu religion and culture. Okay, now we're going to move to China. Virtually all art produced under Mao's communist rule extolled his social and political agenda. Remember that kind of mid 20th century, Mao Zedong takes over kind of in charge of the Communist Party in China. And the virtues of nationalism, gender neutral comradeship, and hard work are consistent visual themes. Chinese artists also integrated contemporary artistic influences with traditional Chinese landscape painting. Here is an example of the propaganda type posters that were being produced. This particular one from 1970 that promotes those virtues of nationalism and gender neutral comradeship and hard work. This one is called Women Hold Up Half of Heaven and Cutting Through Mountains and Rivers, Change to a New Attitude. Okay, so we have looked at some Chinese brush painting before with a lot of landscape type of subject matter. This particular scroll painting is an homage to China's glorious entry into the world's nuclear club, essentially. So at the time, in the 1960s, it was just United States, Russia, and some of the European countries and the United Kingdom that had nuclear weapons, and this celebrates China's kind of induction into that as well. So this painter, Hu Fan, was typically just known for traditional landscapes, images of birds and flowers. He really did not do anything social or political. And then this scroll from 1965 is titled Celebrate the Success of Our Glorious Atomic Bomb Explosion. And so it is certainly a little bit chilling with kind of the idea that you're painting a scroll instead of those, lush landscapes with maybe peaceful trees and things like that. Now we have the cloud of the explosion of an atomic bomb, mushroom cloud. So it is somewhat in that still kind of traditional style of singular objects with not a whole lot of detail in the background, that kind of standard format and palette of traditional scroll painting, but certainly a new subject that is a little bit kind of shocking and unique compared to what we maybe would expect from Chinese landscape painting. And this Beijing-born artist, Wu Guanzong, did live in France for some time prior to the end of World War II, just after World War II. And this is when surrealism was happening, and there was a lot of that automatic writing happening, and that idea of just kind of like writing or drawing and whatever came to your mind. And so this painting, Pine Spirit, kind of reflects that European abstract expressionist style. So the idea is that he would do some little sketches and then bring it like out in nature and then come back to the studio and kind of just let the ink and spill and drip kind of all over the canvas from that basic little sketch. So this is very large, like a lot of abstract expressionist work. The paper is almost 6 feet wide, or long, excuse me, and then it's almost 3 feet tall. But it's, so it's on that same kind of large scale that abstract expressionism was, and it very much envelops viewers, kind of drawing them into this space. You have the very dark ink in the foreground that kind of comes towards us, and then you have that lighter washed out stuff that helps create a little bit of a sense of space and kind of just kind of envelop us in those and the lines and the spaces in between them. Okay, and we're gonna look at Japan. At mid-century, Japan had lost the war, yet within a couple of decades, the country managed an economic comeback, dominating the automotive and electronics industries. Within this setting, the Gutai Art Association, an experimental group founded in 1954, explored new art forms that combined painting with performance and installation exhibits. These artists were much more radical for the era than Western performance artists. And here's an example of some art from that experimental group by Atsuo Tanaka. And this is called Electric Dress. And it's a type of wearable kimono-like style sculpture. And it's composed of brightly painted flickering bulbs and cathode tubes that essentially envelop the body with color and light. And this is a work created by Kazuo Shiraga, excuse me. And he actually uses his body, or used his body, specifically his hands and feet, to create the imagery on his paintings. He was trained in a traditional Japanese style and was one of the country's most avant-garde artists. Whereas he completely abandoned using a brush, similar to the way Jackson Pollock did. He put the canvas on the floor, and whereas Jackson Pollock kind of used sticks and pouring to apply the paint, Shiraga is using his actual body. So he could use his feet to make strokes. Essentially, he would actually hang from a rope suspended from the ceiling above him, and you can kind of even see on that top right place just like a little footprint. Here is a photograph of him working, so you can see him holding on to a rope to kind of steady himself and just using his body to actually apply the paint. And that is going to wrap up this lecture.